Throughout history, explorers have always been faced with unimaginable challenges. During early European voyages to the New World, colonists were frequently killed by diseases, famine, and other maladies that they did not prepare to experience. Countless individuals died on these missions, but in doing so they initiated a transatlantic exchange that would alter history forever. Centuries later, Lewis and Clark were tasked with exploring the western frontiers of the United States. During their journey, they encountered diseases, hunger, and formidable weather, along with countless other dangers to their well-being. However, these explorers were able to map vast stretches of land, collect valuable scientific data on the frontier's plants and animals, and they even established diplomatic relations with Native American tribes. In today's world, explorers are encountering a new frontier, but will still face such unprecedented challenges. Space exploration is dramatically different from anything faced by the human race before, and it will come with a unique set of risks that must be accounted for. Among such dangers, cosmic radiation is perhaps one of the most feared and mysterious risks of space travel. There are both many known and unknown dangers posed by cosmic radiation exposure, but the risks as a whole are often misunderstood by the public. Astronauts will likely need to subject themselves to these risks and knowingly put themselves in harm's way in order to achieve scientific advancement and secure humanity's place in the stars. Now, before discussing how cosmic radiation affects the body, one must first understand what it is and where it comes from. Galactic cosmic rays are ionizing radiation which originate from outside of the solar system, primarily from massive explosions such as supernova. These particles easily penetrate the walls of spacecraft and skin tissue alike, and are a major contributor to the background radiation experienced by astronauts. Our sun constantly emits its own radiation as well, and at times it even releases massive bursts in the form of solar flares or coronal mass ejections. Being outside of a spacecraft during one could pose an immediate threat to an astronaut's health.
In this animation, the sun can be seen experiencing a solar particle event. The radiation is hurled through space and interacts with the Earth's magnetic field. This illustrates the phenomena which protects humans living on Earth from experiencing the amounts of radiation found in space.
Due to these two constant sources of radiation, astronauts are exposed to far higher amounts of radiation than may be found within the Earth's protective atmosphere.
To learn more about the risks of cosmic radiation exposure, I sat down with Dr. Keith Sengel, Professor of Radiation Oncology at the University of Pennsylvania.
Can the risks of cosmic radiation ever be truly, fully eliminated?
That's a great question. It definitely impacts shielding, what you're going to make your shielding of and how much shielding you're needing. I would never say never to anything, just because I don't believe in nevers and always. It makes it a very, very challenging situation because you are going to need some combination probably of a physical issue, the shielding and how we design things and what dose constraints we allow to pass through, and biological, which is, are there ways to mitigate that damage to make it much better? Drugs, food substances, exercise, other different sorts of mitigation strategies. But it seems very unlikely that you'll ever make it zero risk.
Synergistic effects are the result of two or more factors contributing to a single medical issue. Astronauts are constantly exposed to these risks, although many have not been fully studied because of their complexity and a lack of data. The problem with synergistic effects is that scientists must not only determine how radiation affects the body, but how other unique factors of space travel may contribute to the issue. A few of the factors unique to space travel that could create synergistic effects include weightlessness, radiation, a disrupted circadian rhythm, an altered nutritional intake, and increased stress. Synergistic effects are critical to having a full understanding of the risks of space travel, and further the damages that may be posed by exposure to cosmic radiation. Although many of the risks of radiation exposure are known, there are other symptoms which scientists believe could become an issue on missions in the future. Cognitive decline is one such issue that astronauts may experience on a prolonged mission to space. Recent studies have demonstrated behavioral differences in animal trials after exposure to the amount of radiation that would be experienced during a mission to Mars. Radiation is thought to potentially impact memory, learning, processing speed, attention, cognitive flexibility, and executive function. In addition to the cognitive issues that can be induced by radiation, it is believed that astronauts may also experience visual impairments. Astronauts have been reporting blindness since the dawn of space travel, including one astronaut aboard the ISS. This is believed to be due to a disfigurement of the optic nerve as a result of radiation exposure. These issues could be a major threat on a future mission to Mars, as cognitive impairment or visual decline could impact the execution of the mission.
In your opinion, what is the largest risk that radiation poses to astronauts?
Great question. So the largest risk for astronauts is probably what we call the degenerative risk. So risks for tissue effects that might compromise the mission. There is a risk of cancer for sure, and that's potentially catastrophic, but our major concern for these kind of missions is what's going to affect during the lifetime of the mission. And a lot of the things that might happen from radiation might be years down the road, still very important, but may not necessarily directly impede the mission. So probably the biggest effect that people are most worried about is these effects on the brain. Heavy particle HCE radiation, and some models of damage to the brain that are measuring things in animal models leads to very severe cognitive decline, or can lead to very severe cognitive decline. And that's probably one of the big risks. So I think if you had to pick the one that worries people the most right now, would probably be the effects on the brain itself. And second would be the effects on the heart.
Now, what are heavy ions exactly?
So when we talk about radiation, we talk about a whole bunch of different forms. One of the forms is called galactic cosmic rays, and the idea is here that distant cosmologic events have caused big ions. So in these cases, things like titanium, iron, silicon, with a very large nucleus, a very high atomic mass number, to be ejected at very, very high energies. And those are traveling through space. And the biggest danger with those is that because it's a very large nucleus, it can impact into anything else that has a large nucleus. So if you have a material, say a spacecraft material made of stuff like iron that has big nuclei, and a bigger thing being shot at it, the odds of a head-on nuclear collision are greater because you've got bigger nuclei or bigger atomic nuclei. And those atomic collisions between two large ones create showers of neutrons and protons as the nucleus disintegrates. So in place of one big bowling ball passing through and doing whatever it's going to do to a tiny path, now you get a bunch of tiny marbles sort of shooting out from that bowling ball, causing potentially even more catastrophic damage. And perhaps more importantly, the entire energy of that particle can be absorbed instead of just a fraction.
Cosmic radiation has been shown to increase the likelihood of an astronaut to develop cardiovascular disease. Upon returning to Earth, Apollo astronauts were found to be 5 times more likely to develop cardiovascular disease than those who never left low Earth orbit. Astronauts who remain in low Earth orbit, such as those aboard the International Space Station, are still shielded by the outer edges of the Earth's atmosphere from the harmful effects of cosmic radiation that may be found elsewhere in space. Because most astronauts remain in low Earth orbit, the radiation exposure is not representative of what would be experienced by an astronaut traveling to Mars or the Moon. Because Apollo astronauts lacked such protections experienced by astronauts in low Earth orbit, they were exposed to dramatically more cosmic radiation, which in turn caused increased harm to their cardiovascular tissue. These risks of radiation, however, do not exist in a vacuum. Synergistic effects arising from the various unique qualities of space travel increase the risks of an astronaut developing cardiovascular disease. Microgravity, for example, is another major threat to the cardiovascular system. Circulating blood in a weightless environment increases the stress experienced by the heart. Because of this, cosmic radiation is damaging an already stressed heart, further increasing the risks of developing cardiovascular disease. This really does illustrate how unequipped for space travel the human body is, and how every combination of risks must be taken into account to provide a full assessment of the dangers posed by cosmic radiation.
So what sorts of cardiovascular issues could radiation pose?
So we know a lot about radiation in the heart from radiation of patients and from various radiation exposures and radiation accidents. We know that radiation increases the risk of cardiovascular disease. We know that it increases the risk of problems with the heart muscle and the lining of the heart. We know that it can cause problems with the valves. We know that it can cause problems with the conduction system of the heart. More traditionally, these are thought to be higher dose, longer term effects. One of the things that's been pretty surprising as we've started to look at this more in the last decade or so is we've got an increasing appreciation for things that can happen to the heart at relatively low doses and a little bit quicker. And so that, again, is that one of these big risks that can happen. You send a 50-something-year-old person on a mission with a heart that has some level of atherosclerosis, and some level of damage, and some level of just wear and tear. If the radiation accelerates potential problems or makes even rare problems more likely, that can be a really critical thing. So maybe it doesn't cause heart attacks in 100% of people, but if it changes the risk of a person for a heart attack by 10 or 20%, that could be a huge effect. So I think, these are the things that are being looked at. And I think, like I said, blood clots, heart attacks are probably the two big issues. And then what does radiation of the central vascular structure, like the heart lung circuit, do to the body as a whole? Does it release chemicals into the bloodstream that perturb the immune system, and things like that are also pretty important.
Cancer is one of, if not the most recognizable consequence of radiation exposure. Cancer has long been observed as a major symptom of prolonged radiation exposure on Earth, causing many to fear it to be one of the greatest risks to astronauts. The risks of developing cancer are posed by the galactic cosmic rays as well as coronal mass ejections. Large solar events could drastically increase the chances of an astronaut experiencing cancer later in their lives. Solar particle events could raise these risks even further, especially if an astronaut happened to be conducting an extravehicular activity at the time of the phenomena. In reality, however, cancer is not considered to be much of an urgent risk for astronauts. Cancer takes years, if not decades, to appear in the body at the levels experienced during a typical mission. While the safety of astronauts after the duration of a mission is still important to NASA, as dramatically shorter lifespans would reflect poorly on the program, it is not considered to be as dire as ailments that could appear during the mission or shortly after.
What are some of the solutions that NASA is looking at to mitigate risks currently?
When we look at strategies, you can kind of separate them again into physical things like shielding, physical mechanisms. So if you're worried about bone loss, you can do resistance training. If you're worried about weightlessness, you can do compression garments because it'll stop the fluid shifts and things like that. So there's a lot of those kind of solutions that we think about and how those impact upon radiation. Other physical issues, the CO2 levels in the spacecraft can get very high, and you have to scrub them out. There might be interactions between CO2 levels being high and your sensitivity to radiation. So you can modify a bunch of different physical factors of the spacecraft design to minimize the biological response. There's also things that you can do from a biology standpoint that we're looking into. Are there mitigators that you can take, either a medicine that you could just add to the food that would change the radiation response, or even are there foods we can eat? Are there specific diets full of certain antioxidants that might make you less sensitive to the radiation? So there's a whole variety of things. And then on the other side of that, there's what can you take into space to treat problems from radiation? So you first identify the problems, you try to minimize the problems, you try to mitigate the dose, but then you might get a problem and then you need to bring the medicines that are important. And that's really one of the biggest challenges that you have. So there's sort of a multi-tiered strategy that people are looking at.
So should NASA wait to compile sufficient data on the risk of unknown variables regarding radiation before a potential trip to Mars?
You'll never be perfectly safe, and you're never going to be perfectly ready for anything that you do. And in fact, there's a certain amount of learning on the job that you do. So for example, if you were going to take a brand new job at a factory doing something, you could study the factory, you could study everything about the job characteristics, but there'd be something you would learn different actually going to work every day, right, and just doing it. And so, I think that's really an important question about how safe is safe enough, how good is good enough, how much could we know until we do it? We have ground-based analogs, for example, of various space-dependent toxicities, but at some level, the proper study of man is man, and the only way you're really going to know what happens to people in that environment is to put them there. That's why, for example, the space station has been such a critically important stepping stone. We're learning tremendous amounts about what happens, but at some level, you're not going to know everything, and the things you're going to learn are going to be on the fly. So the most important thing is to understand the framework, understand the possibilities of what might happen, and have the right readiness factor.
So do the risks outweigh the rewards of long-term space travel?
That's a metaphysical question. So when a patient comes to me and asks for a note for their work, I don't give them a note that says they can or can't go to work. I give them a note that says, here are the patient's specific medical limitations and specific medical requirements, and you as the employer decide if they can work or what work they can do or whether they need to be fully disabled. In the same regard, we can manage the risks, we can mitigate the risks, but the value of space travel is really not even necessarily for NASA to decide. It's a thing for society to decide. It is, in my opinion, intrinsically valuable to try to go to space. It is intrinsically valuable for a whole bunch of reasons to explore the nearby solar system. There's secondary gain. So we invent new technologies when we are forced to encounter situations that are unfamiliar to us. And that causes technological expansion in a way like almost nothing else. And those technologies then can be used on the Earth to help Earth-side problems that you never would have thought of those solutions. There's exploratory gain. As we explore, it's good to know stuff. The more we understand our planet, the more we understand it's a pretty precarious place with a whole lot of things that could go wrong, that could be extinction level events. And it seems wise to take some risk to spread out if possible and minimize the risks of extinction of the human race. And then there is sort of the individual risk. What risk are we going to allow people to take on to themselves? So what risks, the astronaut may say, I will take any risk. What risks as a society, ethically, do we feel like it's okay for people to take? So it's a pretty complex question when you talk about how we relatively value all of those different aspects.
Even with all of the modern technology at humanity's disposal, it appears as if there is nothing that can be done to eliminate the risks of cosmic radiation. During a future trip back to the Moon or Mars, astronauts will be knowingly subjugating themselves to both the known and unknown effects of cosmic radiation. Many of these dangers will not even be discovered until humans are finally exposed to them, so scientists must work to anticipate what they know will happen along with what could happen. Radiation is often feared due to the wide range of ailments that it can cause. While many of the long-term effects of cosmic radiation, such as cancer and cardiovascular disease, are known, there are many other short-term risks that are currently worrying scientists. These risks are so concerning because they could potentially threaten the execution of the mission at hand. Sudden instances of visual impairment or cognitive decline caused by radiation are currently being examined, but researchers will not know the full scope of these dangers until astronauts experience them firsthand on a mission. Like explorers of generations past, today's astronauts will need to subject themselves to these countless risks associated with their mission and put themselves in harm's way in order to achieve scientific advancement.